my talk is entitled Whither Value Added, and the word whither is really about where do you place this thing, where is it going, and what's going to happen. So this is really trying to craft some thoughts that are rattling around in my head around this notion of value added and trying to get this connection between private strategies and public policies, and sandwiched between those two things, I would argue, is also something that's very important, which is industrial policy or industrial strategy, not necessarily crafted by a government agency, but sometimes crafted by stakeholder groups. Canada Pork, Canola Council, et cetera, et cetera. So in the undercurrent through all of this is trying to get at this notion of how do these things work together in facilitating the emergence of a more value-added orientation within Canadian agriculture, not necessarily at the cost of the commodity approach to looking at things, but maybe as a way of diversifying the portfolio. And I say that, and it's sort of another undercurrent that's been in my head about this, after some conversations with a couple of producers in Southern Ontario where they were expressing to me that, well, you know, the backbone of my business at their family farms was a commodity approach, number 2 yellow corn, particular variety of wheat, bulk sales at a mill. But then they've also got, you know, sort of 25% of their acres in all sorts of specialty crops that are very niche-oriented, that have got all sorts of attributes. And to them, this is just a good diversification strategy. And so within an individual operation, we've got some pretty savvy farmers who are saying, well, we need that kind of diversification because it helps us weather the rough times, but it also means that we can start exploring how we can grow in different ways. Now, so I do a lot of survey work, and so I want to take a quick survey in I was about to say in the classroom, in the room. I want to get a sense from you people about when you think this line was actually said. So this is a quote from a paper. Agricultural policies should focus on creating a market-oriented, self-sustaining farm and food industry that would be economically viable at internationally competitive prices. Who thinks that was written in the last 5 years? Hands up. In the last 10 years, hands up. In the last 20 years, hands up. Okay. That quote appeared in a piece written by Forbes, Hughes, and Worley in 1982, and it was really taken from the 1969 report from the Federal Task Force on Agriculture. It's a redux. We're back to where we were a number of years ago. And I wanted to flag this because I think this has been, this report, and I think Doug Headley's in the room, and hopefully, Doug, I won't embarrass myself in your eyes if I get this wrong, but this report, I think, was a bit of a watershed in Canadian agricultural policy because it got across this notion that the role of government is to develop an enabling environment and that government shouldn't try to manage the agri-food sector. So remember that going through the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, there were different ad hoc programs and approaches to trying to provide stability to the marketplace. Sometimes that involved commercial activity by a government. What I mean by commercial activity by government is actually going out, buying and storing goods, sometimes transforming those goods. And so this report was a reflection of the fact that there's some people around the rooms and in Ottawas and capitals and buildings saying, you know, government's got no business in business. What we need to do is get the environment right. Now, as Maurice said, I'm a bit of an economic history buff, so some of this comes about from my interest in the history of agricultural policy and the economics associated with it. And there's a very important person at the University of Toronto who's written quite a bit about this named Grace Skogstad. And she had a book in 1987 where she has some, I think, some cutting arguments, and I don't mean cutting it's a cutting edge, but she sort of put some blows to ag policy up to the 1970s in Canada. And one of them is as follows. There is substantial agreement that there has not been any consistent agricultural policy that has addressed the problems of agricultural producers. Instead, what existed is a series of expedient measures to meet crises of depression, drought, war, inflation, and surplus. Now, I think that's a bit uncharitable because I think about some of the acts that emerged in the 1950s, like the Crop Insurance Act, the Agricultural Stabilization Act, that this is an earvolutionary thing, not necessarily a revolutionary thing. But she does also have a point that if you look at those different policies that emerged, certainly since the early 1900s, there is a bit of a patchwork. But we also, at the same time, started to see the emergence of a more coherent approach, an approach that reflects the shared jurisdiction of agriculture between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments. She also went on to say, and this is the one that I think is a bit perhaps harsh, maybe I'm being harsh in saying that, the federal government acknowledged its responsibility for agriculture when it was obligated to do so, and it defined that responsibility in a fairly restrictive fashion. Times have changed, though, right? She wrote that in 1987. Looking back, up to 1970. And so if you actually look at some of our framework agreements that we've had in recent years, we can think about going back to 1989 in the Growing Together document. This was, I think, at least in my lifetime, this was one of the very first ag policy frameworks that I had some awareness of and understood a little bit of the mechanics of how it worked. And the pillars underlying this framework were about being market responsive, about environmental sustainability, recognizing that there is regional diversity, and also greater self-reliance. Fast forward to 2002, when we saw sort of the ag policy framework version 3.0, if you will, start to emerge in Canada that reflected the true FPT kinds of arrangements. And the pillars here, as many of you will remember, are business risk management, the environment, food safety and quality, science and innovation, and renewal. And we had a whole set of programs and policies crafted around those programs, including the CASE program, et cetera, so the stabilization programs, but then also programs designed to increase the pace at which Canada was an innovative player on agri-food markets, largely in response to the fact that we were perceived as a bit of a laggard amongst OECD countries. And we've seen two versions since then on fairly regular 5-year cycles. It very much mimics what the U.S. Farm Bill is like for different reasons, but it's sort of this periodic, episodic types of arrangements. Growing Forward 1, again, risk management, recognizing that a central pillar throughout Canadian ag policy has been the stabilization of farm incomes. Initially, that was in the form of price stability, then margin stability, then whole farm-oriented stabilization. We've also saw the pillars around competitiveness and innovation, and then what was euphemistically called addressing society's priorities, which was really some nice language around environment, food safety, and quality. To the current Growing Forward 2 document that is, again, built around risk management, built around competitiveness and innovation, and I think what's important is also built around market development. And so I think we need to think about how some of these pillars have changed and some of them haven't. Risk management has been very, very important. Maybe value-added agriculture is a way for producers to manage their own risk, a la some of the producers I've spoken to in Southern Ontario, where they're using their crop mix and their perspective on commodities versus value-added as a way to minimize some of the risks that they may face in terms of farm income. So that market development one, though, I think is actually quite important, because I think we're at a point where we've got some trade agreements that we're in the throes of seeing some finalization around that could open up new opportunities for Canadian agriculture. That means we could have export-led growth. At a time when we've got a dollar going back to where it was a number of years ago, this is perhaps a good thing to see. So I want to give you a little bit of sense of how I've gotten to the point of what I'm talking about value added. I want to take a quick snapshot looking at some things like measures of farm prices and farm product prices and farm input prices. So Stats Canada has the Farm Product Price Index and Farm Input Price Index, and what this blue line shows is the Farm Input Price Index going back to 2002. The dotted line is a trend line through it. This is the Farm Product Price Index. So this gap doesn't suggest that there's a loss, it's just differential rates of inflation. And so what we see is that input costs have a rising rate of inflation compared to product prices. And so, what's happening is that producers' margins are being squeezed. Well, when margins get thin, you've got some options. One option is you just get big, scale agriculture. And really, this is an argument about economies of size and trying to move down that long-run average cost curve so that you get sort of to the minimum efficient scale and you're able to weather declining commodity prices. But that gap between the two rates of inflation is getting wider and wider and wider every year, and so this puts the squeeze on producers. So instead of maybe getting big, what some producers might do is try to do things differently. Right? They might try to integrate into the marketing channel and try to capture some of the value that's getting added after the farm gate. So if we're thinking about what happens after the farm gate, what you need to think about is, okay, well, what do we know about the value of shipments happening at the food and beverage manufacturing sector, and what's happening relative to producer cash market receipts? And so what this slide shows is food and beverage manufacturing value of shipments, so the value of the goods leaving the back door of that plant, and also market receipts. So I haven't put program payments into that orange line for producers. And what we see is that there's been a widening gap. I think in the last few years that gap maybe hasn't widened at great a pace, largely because commodity markets have been pretty good up until recent history. You know, we've had some periods where we've had very good yields in Western Canada and some high prices. The beef sector and the pork sector have certainly taken it on the chin in recent years. But what we've tended to see is that both of these rise, but that the value of shipments from the food manufacturing sector, it tends to rise at a quicker pace, which reflects more value added. Right? Very simple. So the gap between these two is sometimes taken as a measure of value added. That's actually a very difficult thing to get your head wrapped around, because some of those value shipments out of the food and beverage manufacturing industry go back into the agricultural sector. And so Stats Canada doesn't report this notion of value added like they used to anymore. And so this isn't a very precise measure. What we might think about is something like the farmer's share of the consumer's food dollar. This is some work from Jessica Kelly, who was a graduate student in our department a few years ago. And what this shows is the farmer's share of the consumer food dollar for food in general in Canada. So this includes food at home and food away from home. The food away from home component is a bit messy because that obviously includes the service dimension. But what we've seen over the last, or over the 13 or 14-year time period that she was looking at, is that the farmer's share typically fell from around 19% to around 17%. We've got some upticks in 2009, 2010 that again reflect what was going on in some commodity markets. The point is, the farmer's share is going down, and this is a reflection of value added. And it means what we can take this as is what's left over is what's staying in the food processing sector in the form of a return to some economic activity. And in fact, in Agriculture Canada's recent overview of the Canadian agri-food system, they say farm share of food expenditures has decreased over time as consumers are demanding and buying more value-added food products. Okay? So trying to set the stage. So Jill, where's Jill? Oh, good, you're here. You can answer the hard questions. 'Cause Jill kind of set me up, and we did a little bit of comparing notes and had a couple of casual conversations about what we were going to talk about. And Jill talked about, well, what's value added? And I got the same thing about, well, what do we mean by value added? One way we can think about value added at a very basic sort of maybe turn of the last century perspective is, it's about processing a raw commodity, turning wheat into flour, milling something, slaughtering a cattle beast, that kind of thing. A more traditional approach from a commodity view might be looking at value added as adding space, time, and form utility. Right? The form utility is captured by the process. You're processing that agricultural commodity into food good. Being able to store something can add a lot of value. Right? I mean, I say this to my undergrad students. You got to think about what grocery stores are, and really grocery stores are just a place where you keep inventory before you buy it. Right? It's adding time utility for consumers. And space utility is turning out to be incredibly important for Canada as we have an export-oriented agricultural sector. This is about the utility that consumers get from moving stuff around. So this is a traditional sort of marketing functions approach to what we mean by value added. And in the path of my career, I've actually had a lot of conversations with people about value added this and value added that. And I always say, well, what do you mean? What do we mean by new value added? What do we mean by the current generation of value added approaches? And fortunately, there's a piece that just came out actually in the AAEA publication called Choices, and it's entitled, What Do We Mean by Value Added Agriculture? It's actually it's a very, very, I mean, I shouldn't say it sounds like I'm surprised. It's a very well-written piece, and I think it actually lends some structure to getting your head wrapped around what do we mean by value added, and what are some examples that illustrate how complex some of these chains that reflect value added are. So instead of just thinking about okay, let's add points of value along a supply chain, they recognize that these supply chains are really supply networks, they're really messy, and points of value added can happen in all sorts of places in all sorts of different ways. They also make an important point in terms of their definition of value added, and they back up their definition of value added on the basis of what USDA has defined as value added and sort of what the textbook examples of value added are. And I want to read what their definition of value added is, not because I'm trying to fill time, but because I think there's some really important points here that we need to get our heads wrapped around if we're going to think about this balance between value added and commodity marketing. So they say value-added agriculture is a portfolio of agricultural practices that enables farmers to align with consumer preferences for agricultural and food products with form, space, time, identity, and quality characteristics that are not present in conventionally produced raw agricultural commodities, much along the lines of some of the things that Jill said. They go on to say value-added agriculture can be characterized by farmers changing their position in the supply chain, creating closer and direct links between themselves and consumers, or changing production processes to alter or preserve certain intrinsic characteristics of their farm/ranch products. That's what I'm getting at in these bottom points here. I think version 2.0 plus of value added is really about this notion of adding identity and quality characteristics at the production level, at the primary production level, being able to maintain and identify those characteristics as it moves away from the farm gate towards the consumer. You've got much closer relationships between the producer and the consumer. Sometimes it's a very direct relationship with a farm direct sale, either on the farm or through a farmer's market or a CSA or some other avenue of doing that. And farmers are moving up that chain, right? They're taking on those marketing functions. They got to get paid for that because nobody should work for free. And so if you're going to take on some of these space-time form functions, you need compensation for that. That's where that's the capturing of the value. The other thing that's important is that this is also about differentiating the production practices or systems that you're using and using different production practices and systems, or maybe using different production practices and systems around characteristics of the thing that you're growing or how you're growing it. Right? So we're getting at product and process attributes, and this is where those relationships with consumers and this notion of trust can be profoundly important, because you've got to be able to sell your story. We heard that from the last panel. What's your story? I remember speaking with a young woman who owns a market garden outside of Goderich, seeing her husband live in a 400-foot tiny house that's on wheels. They have a small garden plot, a market plot. They make their living seasonally by selling produce at a farmer's market. And she says, people don't necessarily come to us because we've got really good produce. They come to us because they want our story. They want to know what's our why. Why are we doing this? You've got to be able to preserve that and articulate it in a way that consumers understand and believe, and they have to trust you. If that trust is eroded, all of this falls apart. Okay, so that last point about those production systems and practices is really important. The authors of this piece, and they're from A&M, they're from a food policy group down at A&M, and I think they've done a really nice job in this. They also lay out sort of layers of activities that private sector can take or private actors can take to facilitate this notion of adding value. And so I've said private producer action, because part of my story is this whole notion of private strategies. Well, private strategies should lead to operational and tactical decisions that are about the actions. What are you actually doing? And you can think of this as a hierarchy. And the first thing they say is take on space, time, and form marketing functions. Absolutely. This is version sort of 1.0 or version 2.0 of what is value added. The other thing they talk about is producers taking on horizontal coordination or engaging in horizontal relationships at the farm level with other farmers, and then that vertical integration up the chain with those partners to forge stronger ties to consumers. And so part of this is a farm-to-farm kind of argument, or farmer-to-farmer kind of argument, the F to F, some people might say B to B. So can you actually get groups of farmers who are working around trying to develop a value chain on their own that can work together? That's also critically hinged around notions of relationships and trust. If people in the value chain don't trust one another, things fall apart. That's where the fights happen, right? Especially if there's a lot of money involved. Part of why they like that horizontal coordination is that maybe there's some economies of scope or economies of organization associated with having several different people involved at the farm level, at that primary production level. Maybe you need a critical threshold in order to get access to a particular retailer that you're interested in getting into. Maybe there's some cost sharing that can happen with respect to certain protocols that you're using as part of that different production system or production practice. And then getting up that chain and getting in front of consumers. Now that can be very nuanced, right? There is a grocery store in the U.S. a number of years ago. In the summertime, what they had their fresh corn supplier do was pull up a beat-up old farm truck in front of the store, middle of a Saturday morning. Farmer got out, wheelbarrow, put the corn in the wheelbarrow, took it into the grocery store, and there was a little story behind his family's farm. The consumers saw that. They talked to the farmer. So here's this larger retail chain who's actually doing things that and this was like 20 years ago, that we're saying we need to try to do now because some consumers want to get that story. So that horizontal coordination and integration is important. The other point that they make, the other action that producers can take is this idea of new activity or practices to affect either the identity or the quality of the product. So are you doing something different that changes that raw product in terms of its inherent characteristics or what people attribute to that product. Right? So this is getting at product versus process attributes. So sometimes a product might be viewed differently, not because it's got different inherent characteristics, but because it's been manufactured or produced in a different way or grown in a different way. For instance, grown organically. Well, this is more complex as you go down. Right? That's harder and harder to do. And I think that's a bit of a barrier for a lot of producers is, okay, maybe you can add some of that space-time form activities, but then getting down into you got to change your production practices. Are you comfortable doing that? And a good example of that, I think, where that producer comfort can be create some tension is I'm having a senior moment right now. Wow, this has never happened to me before. No-till. No-till. When no-till was developed in the Palouse, I believe, in Washington State, the people who were advocating it were the pariahs. You know, at the coffee shop, hey, there's Crazy Joe. He's doing this no-till. What's all that about? Is he lost the plot? What's he doing? Well, now we view that as a very important tool in environmental conservation, and the consumers are starting to catch on to that stuff. So sometimes doing things differently at a primary production level can make you a bit of a pariah and sort of they're a little quirky. But it could also be a great opportunity. So there's not just some economic costs associated with this. We also have to think about, from a social perspective, are people actually willing to engage in these things because there's some concern about how their peers might view them. Now, just excuse me a minute. This is when you know I feel comfortable with an audience. I excuse myself to blow my nose. The other thing that these producers have to do is get their head wrapped around how they organize. So remember, one of these bits is this horizontal coordination and vertical integration. And that can actually be quite difficult for producers, and it bears costs. And to get across some things that I want you to think about on that, I want to talk about pirates and the economics of organization. And I don't mean piracy like Gucci bags and CDs. I mean, "Arr, Billy, pirates," you know, with a peg leg and a parrot. There's actually an emerging literature on this in economics. A guy by the name of Peter Leeson at George Mason has written a book called The Invisible Hook, The Economics of Pirate, The Hidden Economics of Pirates. You can read it in about a day. It's a one part hilarious, but one part fascinating book. And his point is, what pirate organizations in the 1600s were really about was order without government. Now, some might call that anarchy or lawlessness, but in fact, there was a lot of order on pirate ships. It's just that it was achieved typically through private treaty. What I mean by private treaty is people getting together and agreeing, here's the rules that we're going to operate on. Here's our process. Here's our governance, our private governance. And yeah, okay, we're stealing money from the crown, and yeah, we're probably killing people, and yeah, we're doing some really nasty things, but internally they had great structure. He also talks about the mafia from this perspective and how there's order without government there. So this whole notion of private treaty is really important because it lays out these ideas of choices, actions, and consequences. So in the book, he talks about how if there is a dispute about how money was going to be shared, there was mechanisms on some ships about how that was resolved. And this varied from ship to ship to ship. Then it was very democratic in the sense of you would elect a captain on some of these ships, and you could de-elect a captain, right? Like we see in some U.S. states with governors. Let's remove the governor. You could see that in some of these ships. The other idea that's going on in this that is maybe a bit nuanced is that he's talking about the process of how you deal with incomplete contracts. Right? So there's probably some implicit contracts amongst those on a pirate ship that doesn't cover everything, but we have a process that deals with that incompleteness. We maybe not have agreed on all the terms and conditions of how we're going to organize, but we've got a process to figure out how we're going to cope with that. I actually think that's really important on value chains and value added, because this is about the economics of organization, and we have to start thinking about things like transactions costs associated with these chains and going back to ideas promulgated by Ronald Coase in 1937 around the nature of the firm. He asked some very important question, or a very important question amongst many others, and his was, why do firms exist? And really it boils down to the cost of market transactions versus the cost of doing it internally. And so you can go out and bear search, negotiation, monitoring, and enforcement costs through an open market transaction, or you can try to internalize some of those decision makings by integrating up a la GM and Fisher bodies, or integrating down, as the case may be, if the cost of doing that, if the cost of that internal economic organization is lower than those transactions costs. Well, this is what value added is about, I think, or part of what value added is about for a lot of producers is maybe it's actually easier for me to integrate up rather than trying to go out and engage in open market transactions in maybe a bit of a commodity model. But you also have to be mindful that there's a tipping point. It's a make or buy decision. Do I do this or don't I do this? Because just because value added works for one person doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work, or a group, it doesn't mean it's going to work for another group based on what their costs are like, what are their internal costs of organization. I would argue that this is where the facilitating environment becomes very important. And Jill touched on this, a couple other speakers touched on this, and what I mean by that facilitating environment, you can think of this big box around market transactions that are the formal and informal institutions that govern how we do business. The rules of the game as set forth by government, sometimes multiple layers of government, and occasionally the unwritten rules of the game about this is how it's done in this industry. And I think getting that facilitating environment is right, and that's where that cohesion comes into play that I talked about in the little paragraph I wrote for this, is if there's going to be private strategy that's pushing the emergence of value added, we need to make sure that that facilitating environment is just as nimble as the economic actors that are working in that space. Because if they're moving at the speed of light and that facilitating environment tends to be stuck 10, 20 years ago, we're going to have a big problem. Right? We're going to be left behind. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about some of the things that were in that definition of value added, and one of them is process versus product attributes, because I think this is one of the key elements associated with value added and value chains. And so the one thing that is important here is, okay, we're living in this world where food's kind of hip and cool, at least to some people with big beards and lumberjack jackets, and, they want authentic. I'm looking at Ken Nakagawa with the beard over there. I'm thinking of Ken. They want authentic. I want the authentic food experience. What does that mean? What does authentic mean? I would argue Olive Garden is an authentic Italian cuisine. That's pretty clear, but what is an authentic hamburger? And how do you verify that? Now, I'm saying this a little bit tongue-in-cheek to be a little bit lighthearted about it, but I think these process and product attributes are really, really important. And do we have organizational structures, either at a private level, at a stakeholder group level, or at a governance level, that allow for verification of either product or process attributes? And who's verifying? And so what I'm getting at here, in some respects, is this notion of third-party certification. Others may disagree, but I actually think how we've dealt with organic certification at a national level has been a good example of how we might see some of this. Now, it doesn't mean that there hasn't been bumps along the way, but maybe those are teachable and learnable moments. But it puts in place an organizational structure and a governance structure that allows us to promulgate this notion of third-party certification, where the third-party certifiers can be trusted. And those third-party certifiers are being trusted because, by act of government, we've got regulations in place that says this is what you have to do or not do, and here's the process by which you get certified, and here's how we're going to get these certifying bodies in play. Okay? And then there's action at either a stakeholder group or a private level group that's important. The communication strategy is also important here. During the end of the Q&A in the last session, we heard quite a bit about this idea of communication strategy and how important telling your story is. Profoundly important. I think it would be as profoundly important for large multinational firms as it would be for that young woman who is selling market garden produce at farmers market seasonally out of her tiny little house. Okay. The other issue that I think goes hand in hand with this notion of verification is verification and certification to what? So we're getting at standards here. And I keep pointing to Jill, but that's because Jill knows a lot more about some of this stuff than I do. Standards can be both public or private, and we often think of standards as being public standards that's defining a grade or a quality. We also see a lot of private standards. We're seeing this with animal welfare right now, where heaps of private standards are emerging that are being foisted down the chain, down that supply chain. Maybe it's becoming a value chain where the value proposition is around enhanced animal welfare. And that's being certified by third-party agents, and audits happen, and there's consequences. The other issue that I heard this morning that I put the bullet point in, this is the advantage of going last, is that you get to include things that maybe you overlooked that other people mentioned. This notion of harmonization of standards internationally. And so the standards that we're being certified to, or we're trying to verify, are they our own standards, our Canadian standards, or are they international standards? Is there scope for harmonization, and how do differential standards affect our ability to compete internationally, and how does it affect us internally in terms of others trying to export to us? And in the same vein along product and process attributes, the thing I harp to my graduate students about, and I think is really important, is that when we think about these kinds of issues, we often think about the views of the consumer. And if you read in some of the public choice market failure literature, there's a guy by the name of Piccoletto who argues that, okay, you've got producers and you've got consumers on two sides of the transaction, but you also have civil society, the non-consumers who have a voice in a marketplace. They're not active market participants, but they can shape outcomes. We've seen this with animal welfare. I think this is going to become a much more important issue when it comes to the genes. And what I mean by the genes are genetically engineered organisms versus genetically modified organisms versus genetic editing versus genomics. I view those as all different things. I get really uptight when I hear people say GM when they really mean genetic engineering. The one thing that we don't have a clue about, I think, now maybe I'm not talking to the right people, is how we cope with gene editing. Because that's not genetic engineering. It's not taking the DNA from one species and putting it into another. It's about snipping small chunks of a species' DNA. I don't think we're ready for this. And I think this is going to be a huge issue if we're going to be an innovative, competitive agricultural sector. Okay. The other issue on product and process attributes is place of production. Now, a few years ago, I had a talk on local, and I was a bit critical of one particular province's approach to local, that along the lines of local is so subjective amongst consumers that saying local is really produced in this province or within 50 kilometers of the province seems a bit silly when your province is thousands of kilometers long. But it's still an important issue, and this notion of verifying local also becomes very complicated. We've certainly seen cases where there's been instances of fraudulent representation of food as local food where it hasn't been food. But you also have to think about other issues related to place of production that go beyond local. So one of them is geographic identifiers, formal geographic identifiers. We see these in Europe. We don't so much see them in North America, but I think there's pockets of agricultural production where the private sector could actually generate a significant amount of value by trying to get this notion around, here's how we do a certain production practice that reflects the terroir, and let's try to get a geographic identifier built around that. One of the examples I've heard of and I've also mentioned before is wine production in Niagara. There's pockets of the Niagara Peninsula, like on the bench, where they've got certain climates that are conducive to particular kinds of grape growing that are unique. There's not many other parts of the world that can grow Baco Noir. We do it relatively well in Niagara. Why don't we have some kind of a geographic identifier around that would allow producers, and maybe it's led by producers, that would allow them to actually use that as their value proposition. On top of all of this, though, is this notion of identity preservation. So when producers move up that chain, what's really happening is that they're not surrendering property rights to the things that they're growing. They're retaining that ownership, and they're doing those different activities. They're keeping that identity. That at some point, maybe that identity or that product then gets passed on to someone else in the chain, and you need to make sure that you keep some identity preservation. I think in the context of the grain industry, we've seen action on this that's been quite important in terms of preserving GM versus non-GM crops and that identity. Bill Kerr mentioned yesterday the role of infrastructure. I think you can't think about identity preservation without also thinking about, have we got the infrastructure to cope with that and the capacity to cope with that? The U.S. has gone through an example of how that can come and bite you with country of origin labeling and the impact that had on the meat processing sector and the costs associated with meat processing when you had to have batches run through particular plants because you knew those batches were from animals from outside of the United States. Building value chains is tough. There is a role for private firms. There's absolutely a role for private firms. I would argue there's a role for industry groups. I don't think there's much of a role for government. I don't think, and, you know, as an academic, I certainly think there's no role for people like me in trying to build a value chain. I wouldn't know where to start. But the role for governments is in crafting that and facilitating an environment, minimizing the transactions costs associated with developing these value chains, making sure that if there's market failures, that there's appropriate policy prescription and mechanisms in place that mitigate the impact of those market failures. Now, I say that, and I think about the work by Charles Wolfe and non-market failure at the same time. So we often think about using government action to try to mitigate the impact of any kind of a market failure, externality, a public good, market power. Sorry, but governments don't always get it right. There's the notion of government failure can be very important. There can be derived internalities, there can be unintended consequences, there can be all sorts of things that can go off the rails because we just can't anticipate everything. There's some incompleteness to it. So we have to also have a willingness to say, hey, maybe that policy is not the right policy, maybe we actually need to change it. Maybe we need to scuttle that regulation in that act and have some nimbleness in doing that so that the facilitating environment can keep up with those agents who are moving at the speed of light and developing value chains. Trust and relationships. This has been a big theme. It was a big theme of CAPC's forum in November. Trust, trust, trust. Trust is really important. What you have to think about is trust on many different layers. One is that farmer-to-farmer trust. If you're forming a producer organization that's going to try to capture value by going up the chain, everyone has to trust each other, right? Because this is about sharing information, this is about sharing money, this is about sharing value, and if you don't trust people, those relationships can sour very quickly. It's also about consumers trusting you and what you do. They have to believe you, and making sure that no one along that chain does something to undermine that trust. Lying is bad. Cheating is bad. We get taught this early in life because there's sort of these central tenets that govern how we behave. So those trust relationships are really important. Now one of the things that I told David about this, David McInnes about this yesterday evening, so I feel a bit comfortable saying it now because the genie's out of the bottle, that when I was at the CAPC forum, one of the things that I kept hearing was trust. And I said to my associate dean, external relations, trust by whom? Whose trust is it that matters? And I think we have some understanding of how Canadians trust the players in the agri-food sector. What I don't think we understand is how people outside Canada trust us. How does a consumer in Padua, Italy, trust a Canadian farmer? Do they? Do they trust the farmer more than they trust the exporters? Who do they trust and how do they trust them? I don't think we have a very good sense at all of where that trust lies outside of our jurisdictional boundaries. The other thing that's important in this is this notion of brand, and that's something else that we've been hearing a lot of. And if you think back to some of those the framework agreements that I posted earlier, one of the framework agreements, I think it was APF, had this notion of brand Canada. And I get that. And I also get that firms want to see some value in brands, although some food marketers would argue that with this whole rise of authentic food and this notion of real food experiences, that brands are becoming dead for some consumers, and that's the heterogeneity associated with consumers. For some consumers, these brands are dead. But for the mainstay, those consumers who tend to be a bit price sensitive, who, like Peter Boxall was telling me, he just goes to the grocery store and typically buys what he bought before. Peter also told me he bought organic milk, which made my jaw drop. Where's Peter? Yeah, the coward's hiding. Brands can be really important for them, that people have trust in certain brands and brands held by certain corporations, right? When you're a university student, Kraft Dinner. It's a brand you can trust. But what about brand Canada? How do we deal with that? And I get why we do that. We've got this whole notion of natural capital and Canada as being perceived as this pristine country with really safe food. We've got good food safety systems. We've got relatively clean water and air. But what happens if something goes south? Right? And what I'm talking about is if you've got this notion of branding Canada and all of the Canadian agri-food system at once, and then you've got a crisis. What happens if we get our own melamine scandal like China had? What happens if there's one food product from one company that's exported internationally that causes a catastrophe? What happens if we get a BSE crisis that's not affecting just Canada but other jurisdictions, and then that shuts down that notion of trusting that brand of Canada by everyone else? It can create an externality. So I think we need to be very careful about how we use that notion of branding Canada writ large for the entire sector. That doesn't mean you don't do it. You just need to be very careful with it, and you need to make sure that it's tied around this notion of safe food and making sure that people understand the protocols that are in place to ensure that we have safe food. Scalability, replicability, and inevitability are also important in building value chains. What I'm getting at on these things is the first one, scalability. Often value propositions are built around small scale or around a particular individual. And sometimes those value chains are built around the smallness of it. The young woman who's selling produce at a farmer's market from her small organic garden as she lives in her small mobile home. What happens when that scale expands? What happens when all of a sudden it's not just her doing that, but 15 or 16 or 17 other people at the market doing that? Now all of a sudden that value proposition isn't that scarce. It becomes a commodity. Price falls. That's one way that you can get a scalability problem, is by this notion that people are replicating what you're doing. The other issue that goes along with scalability is maybe you don't have a bunch of people replicating you, maybe you're trying to get bigger. Well, there's probably a tipping point where you get so big that you're the corporation now. And your value proposition amongst the consumers that value you now goes to zero because you've gone corporate. You're no longer this small-scale independent producer who's doing things differently. You're viewed as a large player, and that value proposition falls apart. So the scalability issue and notion is, I think, one that you need to be very careful of, because there could be a cost associated with that. Replicability and inevitability are also very important, because what we like to be able to do as people who are trying to facilitate and foster these sorts of environments is say, here's an example of someone who built a really successful value chain, and here's how they did it. That doesn't mean you can imitate them, because maybe there's something about that organization that's built around that value chain that's very unique to them. Maybe the person who runs it's got the charm that, just have to put a little smile on, give you a wink of the eye, and, I can sell you anything. I'm not saying that I could do that, but that imitability, there's some intangible things that go along with building some of these value chains that you can lose if you try to replicate them. And again, it's about loss of value proposition or worse, commodification effect. And then infrastructure can also be important. And I think Bill raised this. I want to raise it just again in the context of how you build these chains. 5 minutes, holy cow, okay. This can be a very important issue in terms of the actual physical structure of how this supply chain works. Because remember, supply chains and value chains are different. Supply chains are about the flow of the commodity. Have you got a supply chain structure that allows you to keep that identity preservation and that you can have control over and access to? It's turning out in some parts of southern Ontario agriculture, this notion of infrastructure can be very limiting. One example of that is in the goat and the lamb and sheep industry, where the halal kill is a limiting factor. Have you actually got a plant where they can get an imam in and do a proper halal kill? Right? That's an issue. So that infrastructure could be physical, or it could be some other limiting issue. There's also pressures that people are going to face in building these chains, and one of them is policy-induced private transactions costs. So as the policy environment and as that facilitating environment gets up to speed and is moving at the speed of these other producers, does that also then generate or promulgate responses by firms that raise their transactions costs? Does policy generate a regulatory cost? And that's going to be very idiosyncratic, case-specific in terms of the good that you're dealing with in the particular regulatory environment that you're dealing with. And I think those evolving standards and regulations, on the one hand, you might think that maybe they are limiting the emergence of value added, but maybe they could also be crafted in a way that is nimble, that isn't necessarily terribly prescriptive, that can facilitate the ability to move quickly on a particular idea. Other pressures that I think are important, and this ties back to some points that Jill was making around consumer heterogeneity, is what are the segments that you're trying to get at? Right? So these value chains tend to target particular segments. And do we actually have market intelligence that allows us to identify some of these segments? And can we move at a pace that's quick enough so that we can figure out where the market's going? When I do my survey work, it's often done a day late and a dollar short in terms of where a market might be going, but that's because I'm probably asking different questions than what should we be doing right now. I'm probably asking questions about, well, here's this research issue that we need to deal with. Oops. Then there's the Red Queen effect, right? Everyone remembers Alice in Wonderland and the Red Queen running to stand still, right? These agents aren't working in isolation. They're working in marketplaces, and they're all running together. And for some of these producers and for some countries, they're running to stand still. They're just keeping up. And what we need to think about is how can we actually accelerate the pace that we have so that we can beat some of the competition. I think some of the trade agreements that we're seeing might help with this, but we also need to make sure that the regulatory environment isn't slowing us down. And the last pressure I want to talk about is the commodity market roller coaster effect. At dinner on Wednesday, Richard Gray and I were talking about, it seems like a lot of people are really down in the dumps about, the economy's not doing that well. And I'm actually kind of feeling really bullish about commodity markets, right? But it's a market that can go up and down. There's booms and busts, right? I'm bullish about it right now because we've got an exchange rate redux. Right, we've got exchange rates that are back to where they were in the 90s, mid-90s, and the early aughts. If you're in an export-oriented sector, this is manna from heaven. This is great news. If you're an importer, we've all seen the story about $7 cauliflower. That's a seasonal effect, reflects more than just exchange rates, though. But those ups and downs that sometimes go with these commodity markets can sometimes disincentivize why producers might want to get into a value chain. When prices are high and things are good, do I want to have a value-added proposition where I've got to take on all of these marketing functions? Perhaps not. But it's not the kind of thing, these value chains are not the kind of thing that you can jump into and out of on a regular basis. This is why some of these producers in Southern Ontario who have got these very diversified approaches to how they market, I think are onto something, because perhaps it's about scale and how they might maybe increase some of that value-added proposition in terms of the scale of their operation when there's lean times on the market. The other reason why I'm a bit bullish on commodity markets is this, energy slide. Energy's cheap right now. I realize this may not affect the crops that are going to go in the ground in a few weeks, because I suspect that most of the inputs have been bought. But if we think about if the price of oil stays low, fertilizer costs should go down, cost of running equipment should go down, cost of transportation should go down. That could be good for commodity markets, but we also have to remember that this is largely being driven by OECD stocks of oil, and stocks of oil, like stocks of crops, can go up and down, and if OPEC decides to tighten the taps a little bit, we might start to see up creep in these prices again. So just three very, very simple take-home points. Modern value added goes beyond adding space, time, and form utility. It's really about this notion of identity and quality, and maybe doing something different at the production level, and then capturing that and preserving that as you go up the chain and being able to articulate it to consumers. When you interact with those consumers, trust is of profound importance. So can be this notion of brand, but we need to be careful about what we mean by brand. Do we mean it brand for a private entity, or do we mean it brand for a commodity group or an industry stakeholder group, or do we mean brand for a country? And then lastly, and this is where I put my neoclassical economist hat on, the role of government in fostering this facilitating environment is really important. We've got to get that box that surrounds all of these transactions around how formal and informal institutions work right. And we need to recognize that they have to be just as nimble as the economic agents that work within that box are. Otherwise, we're going to get left behind. The Red Queen effect will kick in, and everyone will start running faster than us. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions, and I'm shameless plug. I'm on Twitter. As my Twitter handle says, it's not the views of the University of Guelph. It's sometimes littered with profanity and typos, but sometimes also entertaining. So thank you, and I look forward to any questions.